Well, welcome back to another episode of Paint Society. My name is Brian and we're working on this older Yukon and doing some rust repair. But to get you guys caught up on how we got to this point, my buddy Jeremy actually purchased a replacement panel for the whole entire lower portion of this truck, but actually went and cut out the section that he needed. So what he did is he cut out and welded in only the portion of metal that he needed to keep things as simple as possible. Now keep in mind, we're very do-it-yourselfers and we don't necessarily know how to weld perfectly, so this is a perfect style video for you all. Now once it was all welded up, he just threw on some black spray paint, which you're seeing here, so it wouldn't really rust in between the time it took for me to take over the job. And that's exactly where we are here with some welds that need some grinding. So we're gonna take you through the process of how to do it yourself repair once you get to this point, if you are in fact doing some welding or just some basic paint work. And this is a square panel that got welded in, and we already started doing a little bit of grinding, but you can see these were just made with a cheap welder, but it actually got the job done. You can see these two pieces of metal are joined, but you know, with any beginner weld, it's not gonna be 100% perfect. So we're gonna do a couple things here to try to minimize any issues down the road. But first, what we need to do is we need to grind this as smooth as possible, and then we'll go from there. Now to do that, we're gonna be using just an 80 grit grinding disc. Now I like to put this on the Milwaukee rotary tool, and this is a great little tool if you actually don't have a big air compressor and you need to do a lot of grinding. So let's go ahead and get these all ground as smooth as possible. Now once that's all ground down, I'm using this paint stripper wheel. You can get these in 3 or 4 inches, and then obviously it's getting a little bit smaller at this point, but this is gonna help to really grind out any of that paint or anything, any debris in between the welds, because we want this to be 100% clean before we move on to the next step. Now this doesn't look too pretty, but we want to make sure it doesn't rust. And the way that we're going to do that first is completely sanding this area. I want to get this all, for the most part, down to metal. And we're going to go ahead with 80 grit to get started and get that all down. Now at this point, listen, we've got it as good as possible, so we're going to be using some of this prep cleaner from Eastwood. It's a pre-painting prep. Now you can get any sort of pre-painting prep. It's pretty much solvent-based cleaner. This one's just a lot handier because it's in an aerosol. A lot of guys that do-it-yourselfers find it easier to just use stuff that's in spray cans. And definitely, I am with you. Now the next step is going to be using some of this fast etch. Now the reason why I'm using this is because these are not perfect welds, and they do have a lot of grooves and crevices and areas where there might just be a little bit of hidden rust still that we don't see, because the time it took to get it over to me to get it done, well, rust can happen overnight, and we want to make sure that nothing has formed. So we're just going to do a little bit of a spray here, and this will actually penetrate into those crevices of that do-it-yourself weld, and it will help to just alleviate any sort of surface rust that might be hanging out. And I let this sit for about a good 15-20 minutes, and then we'll come back and check it out. And after 20 minutes, it's completely stripped of any rust, so I can now move on to the next step with confidence. So once again, we'll use this pre-painting prep, basically is a solvent cleaner, and we're ready for our epoxy primer. Before we put down our primer, we're first going to sand the surrounding area about a good 3 to 4 inches past where our metal repair is. Now we're all masked up for primer. Now the most important thing you're going to want to not ever do is primer right up to an edge. You can see here this is kind of lifted, and there is a body line here and it rolls under, so we have an advantage here when it comes to primering, because we never want to primer right to a solid tape line that's fixed to the actual panel. We did have a couple other scratches that we did feather out, so we will be putting primer on those. But why are we putting primer over something that's not ready for primer? Well, that's a great question, and here's why. We want to use our 2K epoxy first. Now, their epoxy primers have corrosion protection inside of them. They're built that way. That way, when we spray it onto this metal, it will not rust. Now, let's say we were going to put a regular surfacer primer or even a lacquer primer. Although it might look good, it does not have the corrosion protection that you need. So down the road, what will happen is moisture can get behind that primer where it cannot with the epoxy. What you'll see if you have moisture, you're going to have rust start to bubble up and your whole job is for nothing. So use the 2K epoxy. The good thing about the 2K epoxy is it now comes in cans, and here's how you use it. It's got a red cap at the top and it fixes to this little stem here at the bottom, and you go ahead and put that down here. You can push it together or a hard surface, and then once you hear that click that we got and it sprayed a little bit, we know that we can start to mix this. Now, the reason for that is when we puncture the bladder inside, that's going to release the hardener into the rest of the epoxy. So this is 2 parts, just like what I use at work. 2-part primers, 2-part anything is going to be better than 1 part, which is what we call 1K. Now, when we mix this, the ticking time bomb begins. Not that we have to work quickly, but you're not going to be able to pull this off the shelf tomorrow and expect to work the same exact way. So give this a really good shake. I would recommend a good 2 to 3 minutes of solid shaking. And after a few minutes of mixing, it's ready to apply. Now keep in mind, we're going to want to put on 2 to 3 coats because we want to build up the surface enough so when we go to put the body filler on it and start sanding the body filler, we're not sanding directly right through our epoxy primer. But keep in mind, the reason why we want to use this epoxy primer is because we want to go into all these little divots of the actual weld itself. We want to coat the inside of this little crevice here, or this valley of these welds. That way, it's epoxy primer protected rather than putting body filler right over that. What can happen is you might start to get rust where the body filler does not really adhere to the metal properly. We know that a spray can form is going to do that, and that's just what we're going to do right now. We can see here we're going to have a lot of work cut out for us when it comes to body filler, but certainly I think we're a good spot right now where all of our metal is properly protected. So we're back here the next day, and the epoxy has done its job because now the epoxy is in all of these crevices. Yep, it looks horrible. We know that because honestly, we don't really know how to weld, but we at least know it's not going to rust. And next up, we're going to use body filler, and we're going to use a reinforced body filler, but we can't put the body filler right over it. We're going to have to put some 180 grit. Now, the 180 grit is basically going to go in the areas that we're going to put the filler. That way it has something to stick to. It doesn't need to be too crazy, but we basically just wanted to give a little scuff up so that that body filler has something to bite into. So we'll go over the whole entire surface, and then from there, we'll talk about the next step, which is the fiberglass body filler. And this is the next step. This is short strand body filler. This is meant for like if you have little divots or cracks or anything in fiberglass or metal, it's gonna seal it up. Now what I love most about this filler is it's waterproof, so it's not gonna be able to penetrate and create rust. We're not gonna need a lot of this. This isn't the easiest to sand in the world, so we're just gonna put a little bit down and get it in our voids. Now this stuff usually comes gooey, so give it a little bit of a mix if you can. That's actually just the resin that sometimes separates from the body filler. But we know we got a fresh batch here because it's super soft. Usually this stuff, if it sits around too long, it'll just get really thick. We're not gonna need too much here. We're gonna do just a little bit more. Like I said, we wanna use this for its purpose of filling in those voids, and then we'll switch to a body filler that's a little bit easier to sand. Now, when it comes down to using the actual hardener itself, I like to at least go half of it, something like that, give or take. And from this point, when we mix it, we're going to mix it and overlap it. So something similar just to this. We'll mix it, And then we'll overlap it, and then we're gonna get it on the car. Yep.
In the car.
Mm-hmm. Now this stuff's gonna be messy, and this step is not gonna look good at all, but this is all a part of it. It has to look bad before it can look good, and that's just what we're gonna be doing here. So once we have it thoroughly mixed, it will look like one color, and then we can get started by just spreading it on. Yep. All right, so it's been drying, and we're gonna use a 80 grit on the DA to get it knocked down. Now, we're not gonna use this to block, but we just wanna get it all completely knocked down, and then we're gonna block our body filler, but we wanna get this all somewhat level, and we can use a DA for that. Now, I did end up doing a little block sand here. This is 80 grit, just wrapped around a block. It's a little bit wonky in this area. For the rest of it, it's pretty good, to be honest, but this area, I want to try to flatten out as good as possible. I don't want it to look like bowed out in this area because I put too much filler on. So we're ready for our next step. Now this is a body filler. Now body filler is gonna have a lot less pinholes, and the focus of this is to make it smoother, okay? So we're gonna be wiping this on our whole entire panel so we can get it completely smooth. Remember, the reinforced filler that we just used prior, that was for the welds and to make it watertight and really protect the crevices. This is what you're gonna want to really sand it down, and we actually have another filler after this we might end up using. So something like this is gonna be a lot smoother to spread and a lot smoother to sand as well. Now the same logic here, if I have a circle, I'm usually just gonna go about halfway through, give or take. Now you're gonna be able to determine that this is thoroughly mixed because this is a lighter color, yellow. So when we mix yellow and blue together, it's gonna make the color like a light greenish. And see those streaks? We don't want those streaks in our body filler. And we can really tell where they're at because the lightness of the actual yellow itself of the body filler. So again, overlap, overlap, overlap. This is just a way that really helps prevent any of those pinholes or any of those open air pockets inside of your body filler, which will result in you having a little divot in your body filler when it comes time to spread it.
Done.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So this is gonna be a little bit wetter. So it's gonna wanna slide off the panel a little bit more. But you're gonna do your best to get it on. Now we're gonna do our best to wipe the whole entire panel. By wipe, we're gonna do the whole thing. So we wanna get it on first. It's gonna look messy.
Messy? No, it looks.
But that's why we have our paper underneath.
Underneath.
Now I could have used a bigger spreader here. A 6-inch spreader would have been a little bit better because it would have been a little bit more consistent, but we could still make it work here.
Oh. What?
Okay, so once you get it all on, then you can start to make it look as pretty as you can. Remember, it's gonna start to wanna harden up on you, so you're gonna wanna work with it quickly. Right now it's around 80 degrees, 85 degrees, so it's not too bad, but the more harder you put in, the quicker it's gonna kick. Now you see all these ridges here? Don't worry about them too much. But again, if we didn't have a small spreader like this, there would be less ridges, but those obviously will just sand right out. And we're ready for our next step. We're gonna be using our Eagle abrasives P80 and P180. We're gonna be using the block at this point, no longer gonna be using the DA sander to do the leveling. The block is going to level it, and this is gonna be using the vacuum sander as well. So a lot of the dust and filtration will go right into that dust extractor. We'll start with 80 first as it levels, then we'll move on to 180 grit. And after I sanded it with 80 grit, I noticed a little bit of a high spot, so I took this stubby and the hammer and I just knocked it down a little bit. And this is the point where we can reapply it. So if you find anything that's a little bit off, before we go into 180, go ahead and put a little bit more filler on there. This is looking pretty good. I think this will all block out nicely, and then we'll go to the final step, which is the icing or the glaze. Now this stuff is in a tube, so it's a lot easier to use, and the reason why it's in a tube, it's a lot thinner, so it can just squeeze right out. You wouldn't be able to do this with any of the other fillers. It would just get gunked up and never really come out. Same method here. Always important to knead this as well. Sometimes, like I said, it will separate within this little tube, so you want to make sure it's kneaded properly. And I'll go just about halfway across. That will be good enough for me. If you do too much, it could crack. It'll be working too fast. It's not fun. So I feel like that's the appropriate amount for your filler. And once again, we're just gonna take it from the bottom and we're gonna overlap it. You could stir it, but some say that will increase the amount of air pockets it will put in it. So by doing it this way, it just helps to kind of keep it a little less pinhole-ish, if that makes sense to y'all. And again, this would probably have been better if I had a much bigger spreader. But like I said, we're still getting the job done with this 4-inch spreader. Gonna get it all on first. Yeah, it's gonna look yucky, but then it's gonna go on smooth, okay? Yeah, and we might not even mixed up enough, to be honest. Yeah, I think we might need a little bit more, but we'll sand this first, and then we'll go from there, and then we'll see how it looks. Might have just enough to. Right. Smooth it out as much as we can, and this is thin stuff, so it will go far. Yeah, it's starting to dry already, so let's just leave it at that. Yeah, and not the cleanest layup ever, but we've got it on. It started to kick a little bit. I didn't get down here, but I'm not too worried. If I need to, I can put some down there. We can put primer right over the body filler that we had on before, but this is really gonna help us out to make sure it's to make sure it's good to go. So let this dry for a good 20 minutes, and then we'll come back and sand it. All right, so we sanded with 80. Now, some of you might ask, why would you sand with 180 before if you're gonna sand with 80 again? I mean, it's really up to you guys. The reason would be so that the filler will go into a 180 scratch and not an 80 grit. So if it were to shrink, it would shrink into something smaller rather than something larger. But at this point, you can see that the glaze has done its job of filling up any of those spots that might be just a touch low. The next thing we're gonna use is something called a guide coat. Now, some of you just using black spray paint, which is fine, to be honest. The difference here is that this is gonna sand a little bit easier. So it's not gonna gunk up your sandpaper, because the type of paint it is, it's like a powder. So that's the only reason why I would use something like this instead. I'm just gonna lightly put it on, and that's it. You don't need to cover it completely in black. Just like that, that's good enough. And what this is gonna show is your imperfections or any areas where you still need to sand. So let me show that to you right now. Now we're gonna use a regular block here. We're not using the vacuum sander. So if you guys don't have the extraction system, you could just use your regular blocks. But I'm doing this so that you can see it together with me. Basically, if I go to sand an area here, I want to remove all of those scratches. See how the guide coat has gone into the 80 grit? Okay, the guide coat has sunk to the lowest spots of the panel, and you can see here in this area that this is clear of 80 grit, and now it has 180 grit from the sandpaper. So as we go on, basically what we want to do is we're looking for any spot where the black guide coat still is, so we can sand it. Now if it's got an area where it's completely sunken in, like a chip or something, then we're going to want to put a little bit of glaze on it. But that's basically what we're looking for here. 180 grit to take away all of the 80 grit or prior sanding scratches, whatever you might be doing. That's the whole purpose of the guide coat. Now that this has all been sanded with 180 grit, we're going to use our guide coat once more, because we never want to primer over an aggressive sand scratch like 180. I like to primer over 320. So now we're going to step it up, and we're going to be removing the 180 grit. Now, We're going to be using our sander at this point because it's going to leave a smoother finish. Now we have the Kovacs P320 on here, and remember, you might be confused because why are we using our sander? Well, 320 is not aggressive enough or harsh enough or coarse enough to really alter the body work. All we're looking to do here is refine the body filler, the paint, everywhere where we have 180 grit. So if the primer hits it, we can fill it in accurately, smoothly, and we can sand it, and we won't have to worry about shrink back. Now that it's all sanded with 320, we do have some bare metal spots. Now remember, we used epoxy in the beginning of the video, but we're not going to use epoxy now because they're just small little areas, and etch primer will do the job. We always use etch for smaller things just like this out of a can, and it's perfectly fine because this is a 1K product, and this is just going to protect the metal. So once you get that all applied in those areas, we'll give it a good 15-20 minutes, and then it's ready for its next step, which is going to be our 2K urethane primer surfacer. And our next step is going to be that high build primer, and this is a 2K as well. Guys, do not spend all your time doing all that body work just to put a lacquer based primer on there that's not 2K. At least put something on there that is equivalent to what we're using in the body shop, which is a 2K primer. 2K 2 parts has a hardener. Remember, we're going to put this red cap here on the bottom, and it's better on a hard surface. We push really hard, you hear that pop, and then from there we again have punctured the bladder of the hardener. So now the bladder of the hardener and the actual primer itself are going to mix together. Now we got the vehicle outside. I'm going to be putting this on a little bit heavier because I want it to fill in, and then from there, once it's all dry, then we can sand it and get that much closer to paint. And we're going to apply it on pretty thick. Remember, this is high build, so it's going to be able to fill in any minor imperfection, and I mean minor. We really want to make sure that we took the time to do that glazing putty. So now this can do its job as a primer and just fill in those 320 scratches. See, this thing is coming out pretty nice. And it's so hot out here, just 5 minutes is enough time for it to dry. We'll apply that second coat right now. We're doing about a 75% overlap. That means about a quarter more at a time is being sprayed. And then you can put a little bit more on just by slowing it down so you get a little bit thicker coat. And that's after 2 coats, and I'll put the third coat on off camera, but basically the same exact thing. So we'll allow this to dry a good, I would say a good 5-6 hours should be dry enough. But if you want to give it a little bit more time, it's fine, you can come back the next day. This has been a project for me that I've been working on, I would say at least a few hours a day over the course of 4 days. And we're back after a day. We put guide coat on there because we want to sand that primer. Now you can't just paint over primer. It's going to be a little bit rough, and what we're going to be doing here is we're going to sand it, and then we're going to go ahead and paint it. But before we sand it, we're going to do this with water. And we're getting that water all ready. And what we'll put in here is just a little bit of degreaser, and we'll use some super clean, and this will just help to clean it up as we go ahead and get this thing all sanded and ready for paint.
Has a bubble. So just clean it.
And what we're going to use for this is a 600 grit, and we have our block, and again our water is right below the camera here, and we're just going to go ahead and sand it. Now the reason why I'm using water with primer here, a lot of do-it-yourselfers are going to find this method to be really efficient because it's not going to clog up the paper. You can't do this with body filler because you don't want to put water into the body filler, but we can see here that the actual primer is starting to show through here as we remove that black guide coat, and that's going to be an indication that we can further move along to a different area. And this is completely smooth. Now we don't want to do more than 600 or less than 600. If we go higher, 800, we could get away with it obviously, but it's going to be a little bit too fine. I'd be concerned about adhesion, and 400 might be a little bit too rough. So let's go ahead and get this all sanded down, and then it'll be ready for some paint.
It's
hot, I know.
It's hot.
We're all ready to paint. Now we're gonna be using the pre-painting prep again, and we're gonna be using a microfiber towel, which we've been using throughout the process. You can get these at Walmart or even in the Amazon store. I'll leave a link, but they are awesome because you can reuse them and they really absorb. Now this pre-painting prep is going to remove any of the contaminants or anything still left on the surface. So make sure you soak it up pretty good. And then we're going to try to wipe it as best we can in one direction. And once it's all wiped, this will not leave any lint. We're ready for paint. Now here's our base coat. It's put into a spray can and make it very easy for the do-it-yourselfer. This is just a base coat, so it will dry matte. You will need to apply a clear coat after this. This is mixed up to the color code of the actual vehicle to provide the best possible match. We're gonna do light coats and about 4 to 5 inches from the panel. We'll allow this to dry a good 5 to 10 minutes before our second coat. We're ready for our second coat. You can see how smooth it is. And that's the advantage of having OEM select paint or any real paint put into a spray bottle. This is not a lacquer-based product, so it's gonna go on much smoother. Around 75% overlap and about 4 to 5 inches from the panel, keeping it moving and not stopping. We'll allow this again to dry about 5 to 10 minutes, depending on the temperature, and then we'll be ready for the third coat, and then we'll see if it needs another coat. Now we have great coverage. Now for my final coat, I'm gonna increase my distance only by a couple inches. That way I can put it on and it's not gonna be splotchy or look uneven. We wanna make sure we don't have any streaks in the paint. So by increasing your distance by a couple inches, this is gonna help kind of cloud on the paint and put it on just a little bit more even than it would be if you were to put it on just by doing strokes, okay? So we did a little double coat there, and that should wrap it up. So we've reached the last step in the process. So far we've used our epoxy, and then we used our high build urethane primer, and then our color coat, and now we're gonna be using our clear coat. This is a 2K clear coat. So again, you'll use the cap at the top to puncture the bottom, and then thoroughly mix those two contents together for a good 3 to 5 minutes. The more you mix it, the better it's going to spray out and consistently dry. Now, what you can do from here is about 2 to 3 coats. You're gonna be around 3 to 4 inches away from the panel, moving a little slowly to get it on nice and shiny. All right, so that's the first coat. Let's let this sit for a good 10 minutes and then we'll get to the next coat. Now I gave it a good 10 minutes. We're ready for the second coat. And here it is, only a few minutes after we painted it, and I want to take off this piece of tape because we did get lucky because there is kind of like a body line here that we could kind of just sink paint right off of. And that's just what we're doing here. So we don't have to like melt it in or burn it in. Maybe just a little polish if anything. I don't know how the color's gonna match. This truck has like 3 different colors on it. If we take a look at it, this looks like the original color, more of a gray, but this truck's in pretty tough condition. This is more green. You can see here it's got a green hue to it, but we've got more projects for this truck. You can see it's got some love holes underneath all these little hearts, and maybe a new hood. This project, we're not gonna get too deep into it, but just maybe a couple things here and there to kind of spruce it up. With the help of Eastwood and some do-it-yourself projects. So at this point, let's let this dry. Let's let this dry a good a good 2 or 3 hours. We removed the tape anywhere where it could be bridging, which isn't really necessarily anywhere except for the top there. And then we'll unmask it and we'll see how good the color matches. Well, here she is. She is all completely done, and take a look at this. Offhand, really, you don't even notice that there's any difference. Now, I will tell you that this vehicle has been painted over a few times. You can see here the quarter panel is a little bit redder than the rest of the vehicle, and the rest of the vehicle is a little bit greener. Now, the paint code that we did get mixed up is original to the actual vehicle. So if your car has been repainted over a couple times, that's going to be a little bit difficult for you to get the right color. Of course, if you blend into the quarter panel, it will look seamless. But I think this car is going to be on the Paint Society channel in the future, because you can see it needs a little bit of work. But as far as our repair is concerned, it came out really, really good. Now, let's talk about if you did not like the way it came out, if it's bumpy, if it's dirty, don't even try to polish it, guys. Go ahead and sand it down with a 600 grit and just re-clear it or repaint it. That's going to be a lot easier than polishing. Now, it only took 1 can of paint to get this all painted up, 1 can of base and 1 can of clear coat, and it looks really, really good. Not a perfect match, but again, for the vehicle it's concerned, the different colors and variations on this vehicle, I am quite happy with it. Now, one thing you're going to want to do is make sure that you get some sort of corrosion protection behind those welds so that they don't actually rust back through the panel itself. But the bodywork I'm very happy with, and this is going to be a long-lasting repair, and we're going to be seeing this vehicle on Paint Society as well for some more repairs. Now let's head into the garage and talk about some final thoughts. Well, we have successfully pulled off a beautiful job in our own home garage. Now, for you all wondering, is this a job that you can do? You can 100% do it, but I will tell you to remember certain things. Is the cost of the materials more than the cost it would take it to a shop? Also, what are your expectations? I would never attempt this on a newer car. Spray can repair is for an older vehicle. Even though these are newer spray cans and newer technology, nothing can ever replace a spray gun. But if you guys can do this at home on an older vehicle, it's going to be right just for you. Now, one big question I know you're going to ask me is, can I paint my whole car with a spray can? And I would recommend no. One, it's going to cost you way too much. Honestly, I would never even recommend using a spray can on something that's flat. What's going to happen when you turn it like this is it's going to sputter and it's going to spit. Any spray can will do that. So it's not my recommendation that you do any flat surfaces. If you have a panel that can come off, then you can hang it, and that might work out better for you. Also keep in mind, obviously, the cost is going to add up. You might be able just to buy a spray gun and a small compressor to get your project done as well. For our project, once again, it was only 1 can of base and 1 can of clear coat, as well as 1 can for all the other primers that we use. The spray can method is really great for small projects like we saw here on the channel. So get your family together, spend a little time in the garage, and get the project done. Guys, this is Brian from Paint Society reminding you, don't overthink it. It's just paint. I'll see you guys on the next episode.